He was just a mechanic, grease under his fingernails, a daughter to feed, and a garage that smelled like motor oil and old coffee. Nobody looked twice at Holt Caldwell. Nobody remembered his name. But when a truck rolled up to his shop one Tuesday morning and unloaded 6 engine blocks stamped for destruction, engines he had designed with his own hands 12 years ago, Holt went very still. Because those weren't junk. They were his life's work. And the billionaire CEO, who just called him a backwoods nobody, had no idea she was standing in front of the man who built her entire empire. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. The truck arrived at 7:14 in the morning, which Holt knew because he'd been awake since 5 and had already burned through half a pot of coffee by the time he heard the diesel engine rumbling down the gravel lane toward his shop. He was underneath a 2009 Silverado at the time, replacing a cracked exhaust manifold for a guy named Curtis, who would complain about the price no matter what Holt charged him. That was fine. Holt was used to it. He'd been running Caldwell's auto repair in Asheville for 6 years, and he'd learned that some customers were just like that. They needed the work done. They knew they needed the work done, and they resented needing it done anyway. You couldn't take it personally. You just handed them the invoice and let them get it out of their system. He slid out from under the Silverado when he heard the truck slow and stop. A flatbed. Heavy duty. The kind used for hauling industrial equipment, not car parts. The driver was already climbing down from the cab, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on despite the gray October sky. "Caldwell's?" the driver called. "That's me. Got a delivery, 6 engine blocks. Paperwork says disposal." He held out the clipboard. "Sign at the bottom." Holt looked at the clipboard, then at the flatbed. The engine blocks were strapped down under a green tarp, the kind of tarp you put over things you don't care about anymore. He signed where the driver indicated and walked around to the back of the truck. The driver pulled the tarp off without ceremony. Holt looked at what was underneath, and his body went completely still. Not still the way a person goes still when they're thinking. Still the way a person goes still when something hits them somewhere deep and unexpected, in a place they'd spent years making sure nothing could reach. The engine blocks were dirty. Surface rust on the casings, the intake ports clogged with old grime, the identification plates barely readable. They'd been sitting somewhere for a long time. Somewhere not climate-controlled. Somewhere nobody had cared about them. But beneath all that neglect, beneath the rust and the dirt and the years, Holt could see the architecture he'd built. The specific geometry of the cylinder head, the distinctive cooling channel configuration along the left bank, the offset mounting bracket placement he'd argued about with the fabrication team for 3 weeks back in the winter of 2009. These were VP7 engines. His VP7 engines. "You okay, man?" the driver asked. Holt realized he'd been standing motionless for almost a full minute. "Yeah," he said. "Where'd these come from?" "Vrani Motors, corporate said to deliver them here for scrapping. You contracted for disposal, right?" Holt didn't remember making any such arrangement, but someone at Vran apparently did. He looked at the 6 blocks again, at the casting numbers barely visible through the grime on one of them, and something moved in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, a recognition that went deeper than memory. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll take care of them." The inside of the shop smelled like it always did, iron and oil and the faint chemical undertone of brake cleaner. Holt had a lift on each side of the main bay, a parts washer along the back wall, and a workbench that his daughter Wren had covered in drawings the previous summer. Race cars and horses, and a surprisingly detailed rendering of what she claimed was a dragon, but looked more like an elongated iguana. He'd never had the heart to move the drawings. They were taped over an old Snap-on calendar from 3 years ago, and he figured that was fine. He used the shop's engine hoist to move the blocks inside one at a time, setting them along the back wall in a row. It took most of the morning. By noon, his back was aching and his coffee had gone cold twice, and he still hadn't touched Curtis's Silverado. He stood in front of the 6 blocks and looked at them for a long time. Engine number 3 was closest to the door, the rust on its casing more advanced than the others, a long streak of orange-brown running down the intake side like a scar. Holt crouched down and found the casting number he was looking for, partially obscured but there. He reached into his chest pocket for a rag, a habit, always a rag in the chest pocket, and cleaned the number until it was readable. VP7-003. He'd built this engine in the spring of 2010, working 18-hour days for 6 weeks to meet a fabrication deadline that the race team had handed down without consulting anyone in engineering. He remembered the specific frustration of that period, the arguments with the manufacturing floor, the 2 weeks he'd spent redesigning the lubrication circuit because the original spec couldn't handle sustained RPM loads above 9,000. He remembered the exact moment the dyno tests came back, and the numbers were better than anything they'd projected, and he remembered standing in the test cell and feeling, not triumphant exactly, but something quieter and more honest than triumph. Something like, yes, that's right, that's what it was supposed to be. The VP7 program had made Vrana motors. That was just a fact. The engines had dominated the endurance circuit for 3 consecutive seasons, had become the benchmark against which every other manufacturer's powertrain was measured, had built the company's reputation for engineering excellence from the wheels up. Automotive publications ran profiles. Racing teams competed to license the technology. Vrani's revenue had nearly tripled in the 4 years following the program's debut. Holt had built it. All of it. And then they'd taken it from him, and he'd left, and he'd come here, and he'd built a smaller, quieter life that was mostly about Ren and was occasionally about other people's broken vehicles. That was the whole story. He told himself it was enough. He looked at engine number 3 and thought, it wasn't enough. Ren came home from school at 3:15, dropped her backpack inside the shop door, and stopped when she saw the engine blocks lined up along the back wall. She was 9 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn silences, and she'd grown up in this shop the way some kids grow up in restaurants or farms. It was just the landscape of her childhood, the smell of it, the sound of it, the specific quality of the light that came through the high windows in the afternoon. She could identify most engine configurations by sound and had opinions about socket sets that Holt found both impressive and slightly alarming. "What are those?" she asked. "Old engines." "They're huge. What kind?" Holt considered the question. "The kind I used to build," he said, "a long time ago." Ren walked over and studied them with the same focused attention she brought to most things, which was more than most adults managed. She pointed at the casting number on number 3. "VP7, she read. "I've seen that in your old books." He had a shelf of technical manuals in the back office, most of them obsolete now, organized by year. He'd never hidden them from her, he just hadn't talked about them much either. "Yeah," he said. "Why do they look like that, all rusty?" "They've been sitting somewhere for a while. Somebody decided they weren't worth keeping." Ren looked at him with the expression she got when she thought an adult was being demonstrably wrong about something. "That's dumb," she said. Holt almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "That's dumb." The call came 2 days later. He was deep in the Silverado again, Curtis's manifold finally addressed, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He ignored the first 2. The third time he gave up and answered without looking at the screen. "Caldwell." "Is this Holt Caldwell? Caldwell's Auto Repair?" The voice was female, precise, with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd been on enough phone calls to have learned that tone conveyed authority without effort. "That's right. This is Nadia Vance. I'm calling on behalf of Vran Motors CEO Marin Vrana. Ms. Vrana will be visiting your facility tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to assess the status of the VP7 disposal." Holt wiped his hands on his rag and leaned against the Silverado. "The CEO's coming here personally." "That's correct. To check on 6 engine blocks that were sent here to be scrapped." A very brief pause. "Ms. Vrain prefers to handle matters like this directly." He could have said a lot of things. He said, 9 o'clock's fine." She arrived at 8:52 in a black SUV that looked like it cost more than his building, followed by a second vehicle carrying 2 people Holt assumed were assistants or security or some combination thereof. The driver opened her door, and Marin Vran stepped out and looked at the exterior of the shop the way people sometimes looked at things they were surprised still existed in the world. She was younger than he'd expected. The news coverage he'd seen, not that he'd been following it particularly, but you couldn't run a business without keeping some peripheral awareness of the industry, had made her seem older, which probably had something to do with the fact that she'd taken over a billion-dollar company at 28 after her father's heart attack, and that kind of thing aged a person in perception, if not in fact. In person, she was clearly 30, maybe 31, with the particular controlled composure of someone who'd been performing competence under scrutiny for long enough that it had become second nature. She was wearing clothes that were too nice for a garage. That was the main thing he noticed, practically speaking. Holt met her in the lot, his work shirt already carrying the morning's grime. He didn't apologize for it. "Ms. Vrain," he extended his hand. "Holt Caldwell." She shook it briefly. Her handshake was firm and efficient, the handshake of a person who'd been advised that a weak handshake undermined credibility. "Mr. Caldwell, thank you for seeing me on short notice." She looked past him at the open shop door. "Are the units inside?" "The units." "Yes, ma'am." He led her inside. One of the assistants followed, the other stayed by the vehicles. Marin walked to the center of the bay and looked at the 6 blocks along the back wall with an expression that Holt couldn't immediately read. Not quite recognition, not quite the blankness of someone looking at objects they considered inert. "Are they intact?" she asked. "Yes. They're in rough shape cosmetically, but the internal components look solid. I haven't done a full inspection, but from what I can see, the bores are... That won't be necessary." She turned to look at him, and the expression settled into something more legible, a CEO whose time was being used inefficiently. "The disposal contract specifies full destruction of the blocks and documentation of the process. We need this handled within 30 days. Holt looked at the engines, then at her. "Destruction. That's correct. These are VP7s. She blinked, once, with the tolerance of someone who dealt regularly with people who didn't understand context. "I'm aware of what they are, Mr. Caldwell. They're obsolete prototypes that are taking up space and creating potential liability. Liability. Intellectual property concerns. There are competitor interests who would pay significantly for access to Vron's older proprietary technology, even outdated technology. It's a compliance issue." She glanced around the shop with a slight adjustment of her posture. Not contempt exactly, but the visible recalibration of someone who was not where they were used to being. "I understand a facility like this might not have direct experience with that kind of concern." Holt let that land without reacting to it. He'd been reacted to in worse ways. "And the documentation of destruction," he said, "that would need to come from me." "Yes. The contract specifies photographic and written record. Standard disposal documentation." He nodded slowly as if he were thinking it over. He wasn't really thinking it over. He'd made his decision about these engines 2 days ago when he cleaned the casting number on block number 3, but he looked at them one more time and something made him ask, not to challenge her, not yet, just to see what she said. "Are you sure you want to throw away engine number 3? The question sat in the air between them. One of her assistants looked up from a phone. Marin Vran looked at Holt with the expression of someone trying to determine whether they were being tested or condescended to. "Excuse me?" "Engine number 3, right there." He pointed at VP7-003, the rust streak still visible on the intake side. "Are you sure about that one specifically?" "They're all going to be destroyed, Mr. Caldwell. That's the contract." "Right," he said. "Okay." She looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation required. Something moved behind her eyes. Not suspicion yet, but the early precursor of it. The place where certainty starts to feel slightly less certain. Then she pulled her coat straighter and turned toward the door. "Someone from our legal team will send you the updated documentation requirements. 30 days, Mr. Caldwell." "I heard you," he said. She walked out into the October light, and the SUV door opened for her, and then they were gone, and Holt was standing alone in his shop with 6 VP7 engines and the specific silence that follows when something important has just been set in motion without anyone saying so out loud. He stood there for a minute. Then he went and found his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 4 years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Well, I figured I'd hear from you eventually. Hey, Dell, Holt said. Del Mosby had been his engineering partner at Vrane Motors for 7 years, the only person on the powertrain team who understood what Holt was building at the level it needed to be understood. He'd left the company 2 years after Holt, for his own reasons, and had spent the intervening period doing consulting work out of a machine shop in Knoxville, and pointedly not talking about the years he'd lost inside a corporation that had decided his contributions were company assets to be absorbed rather than labor, to be compensated. You're looking at the VP7s, Del said. It wasn't a question. 6 of them. They want me to scrap them. A long pause. Long enough that Holt could hear a radio playing in the background of wherever Del was, something country and indistinct. You're not going to scrap them. No, Holt said. I'm not. Another pause. I'll drive up Saturday, Del said. Don't touch anything until I get there. I've already touched them. I know you have. I'm saying don't do anything structural until I get there. Holt looked at the engines. Number 3 with its rust streak. Number 6 with the slight deformation on the intake flange he'd already noticed, probably from improper storage conditions. Number 1 with the casting he'd personally signed off on in the foundry. The signature so small and in such an inconspicuous location that no one had ever found it except him. Saturday, he said. Saturday, Del confirmed. And Holt? Yeah. Don't let them destroy those engines. I know, he said. I know. He hung up and set the phone on the workbench, next to Wren's most recent drawing, a horse this time, galloping across a lined notebook page with more energy than technical accuracy. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put on his work gloves, moved to the nearest engine block, and began cleaning off 20 years of rust and neglect. The engine underneath was exactly what he'd known it would be. It was perfect. Del Mosby arrived at 7:40 Saturday morning, which was earlier than he'd said he would, which meant he'd driven through the night, or most of it. Holt heard the truck before he saw it, a battered F250 with a cracked passenger mirror that Del had been meaning to fix since approximately 2019. And he was already pouring a second cup of coffee when Del came through the shop door carrying a duffel bag that clinked with the particular sound of precision tools wrapped in cloth. Del was 51, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered more by concentration than by weather. The deep lines around his eyes were from years of squinting at tolerances, not from sun. He'd been the best machinist Holt had ever worked with, which was a specific kind of compliment, the kind that didn't come with warmth attached, but meant more because of it. He set the duffel down and looked at the 6 blocks lined up along the back wall and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then, they sent them out looking like this? They weren't in storage, not proper storage anyway. Holt handed him a coffee. Somewhere damp, probably a satellite facility they stopped maintaining. Del crouched in front of number 3, the one with the rust streak, and ran 2 fingers along the intake side with the careful attention of someone reading something written in a language most people had forgotten. Surface only, he said quietly, more to himself than to Holt. He moved to the next one, then the next. He went down the whole row that way, touching and looking, and Holt let him do it without interruption because that was how Del worked and always had been. When he reached the end, he stood up and drank his coffee and looked at the row of engines like a man looking at something he'd been told was gone. They have no idea what they have, Del said. The CEO told me they're a liability, IP concerns. Del made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. IP concern, that's what they're calling it. Garrett Voss's people drafted the disposal contract. That's what the paperwork said. Del turned to look at him then. His expression didn't change much. Del's expressions rarely did. But something behind his eyes went careful and precise in the way it did when he was calculating something he didn't like the answer to. Voss is still COO, far as I know. Holt. Del set his coffee cup on the workbench. Voss was the one who pushed you out. You know that, right? It wasn't just Harlan Whitfield and the board. Voss was the mechanism. Holt knew that. He'd known it for years in the way you know things you've decided not to spend energy on because the energy has to go somewhere useful or it just becomes poison. I know, he said. So Voss sends these engines to you specifically, to a guy running a small shop in Asheville who has no connection to Vrana Motors on paper, and marks them for destruction. Dell paused. That's not an accident. Holt had thought about that too, in the night since the truck arrived, in the hour before Wren woke up when the shop was still dark and quiet, and the engines sat in a row along the back wall like something waiting to be understood. He hadn't arrived at a comfortable conclusion. No, he said. It's probably not. Someone either doesn't know who you are, or they knew exactly who you are and figured you'd just follow the contract. Or both, Holt said. Different people making different assumptions. Dell picked up his coffee again. Which one is the CEO? The one who came here. Maren Vran, I don't know what she knows. She was 22 when I left the company. I never met her. Holt leaned against the workbench. She's trying to hold the company together after her father died. Voss has been running operations for 2 years. And she trusts him. She doesn't have a reason not to. Not yet. Dell looked at the engines. We restoring these? Yes. All 6? Starting with 3. If the internals are what I think they are, we'll do all 6 eventually. Holt pushed off the workbench. But 3 first. I want to know what's in there. Dell reached into his duffel and pulled out a bore gauge wrapped in a red cloth. He unwrapped it with the particular care of someone handling something they'd owned for a long time. Then let's stop talking about it, he said. Chet. The work took over everything the way serious work always did, which was why Holt had always been slightly suspicious of people who claimed to maintain perfect separation between their professional and personal lives. The engines were inside his shop, which meant they were inside his days, which meant Wren navigated around them after school the same way she navigated around everything else in the shop, with the pragmatic adaptability of a child who'd grown up in a space where adults were frequently occupied with things that required concentration. She learned the names of the engines by number within the first week. She had opinions about which one looked the best. Number 6, she decided, because it had a more symmetrical casing, which Holt had to admit was not an incorrect observation. And she brought coffee to the workbench on the nights when Holt and Dell stayed late, setting the cups down without being asked, and then settling into the old office chair in the corner with a book or homework, filling the space with the quiet company she'd always been good at providing. On the second Tuesday after Dell arrived, she looked up from her homework and asked, "Did you build these when you worked for the car company?" Holt was elbow deep in number 3's cylinder head. "Yeah," he said. "I did." "What company?" A beat. Dell, who was running measurements on the crankshaft bore of number 5, didn't look up, but went slightly still in the way people do when they're listening more carefully than they appear to be. "A company called Vran Motors," Holt said. "Racing engines. Before you were born." Wren was quiet for a moment, digesting this. "Why did you stop?" "It got complicated." "What?" She accepted that the way she accepted most of his non-answers, not happily, but without pushing, because she'd developed an instinct for which silences her father needed and which ones he was just being stubborn about. She went back to her homework. Dell went back to the bore gauge. Holt went back to the cylinder head. But later, after Dell had driven back to the motel he was staying at and Wren was asleep, Holt sat on an upturned crate in front of number 3 and looked at what they'd uncovered over the past week and a half. The internals were better than surface conditions suggested, significantly better. The cylinder bores were within tolerance on 4 of the 6 blocks, with 2 showing wear that was addressable with a careful re-sleeve job. The crankshafts were intact. The valve seats on number 3, the one he'd been most worried about, were in condition that, if he was being honest, shouldn't have been possible given the storage environment. These engines had been built to last. He'd built them to last. He hadn't quite understood, until this week, how much it had cost him to walk away from them. Maren Vrana found out about the mechanic on a Thursday morning, 11 days after her visit to the shop, when she was sitting in her car in the Vrana Motors parking garage with 5 minutes before a board meeting and a headache that had been building since approximately 6 a.m. She'd been thinking about the mechanic, Caldwell, intermittently since the visit, which annoyed her because there was no rational reason to be thinking about him. The disposal contract was straightforward. The timeline was clear. His facility was small and probably unequipped for this kind of work, but that was his problem to manage within the contractual deadline. She had 17 more significant problems to address that week, none of which involved a mechanic in Asheville. And yet, she kept coming back to what he'd said, standing in front of those engine blocks with grease already on his shirt at 9 in the morning. "Are you sure you want to throw away engine number 3? Not a question about the contract, not a question about the timeline or the compensation, a question about a specific engine, by number, with the particular tone of someone who already knew the answer was wrong. She'd asked Nadia to run a background check the same afternoon she returned from Asheville. She'd told herself it was standard due diligence for a contracted vendor, which was technically true if you applied the loosest possible interpretation of standard. The report came back with almost nothing useful. Holt Caldwell, 38, sole proprietor of Caldwell's Auto Repair, licensed in North Carolina, no significant business history prior to the shop's registration 6 years ago. 1 dependent. No corporate affiliations. Clean record. The profile of a man who had either always been exactly what he appeared to be, or who had very deliberately become something simpler than what he'd been. That second possibility was what kept snagging at her. She'd asked Nadia to go further. Nadia had, reluctantly, because it was clearly not standard due diligence anymore, and had come back yesterday afternoon with something that made Marin sit in her office for 40 minutes doing nothing but reading. Holt Caldwell's name didn't appear in any Vrine Motors documents. She'd already known that. The original background check had confirmed no corporate affiliation. But Nadia, on a specific hunch that she hadn't fully explained to Marin, but that Marin suspected was better intuition than investigative method, had searched patent records instead of corporate records. And there, in the Automotive Engineering Patent Database, under filings from 2007 through 2011, was a different picture entirely. 12 patents, all filed under a company called Caldwell Mosby Engineering, LLC, which had been dissolved in 2012. 7 of those patents described core design elements of the VP7 engine program, the variable geometry intake manifold, the dual-layer thermal management system, the specific crankshaft counterweight configuration that gave the VP7 its extraordinary balance characteristics at high RPM. Technology that was now owned entirely by Vrine Motors under licensing agreements that Marion had never examined because they predated her involvement in the company by years. She'd taken those documents to her father's former chief counsel, an old man named Hargrove, who'd been with the company since before she was born, and who was now theoretically retired but who still answered his phone when she called. He'd spent 20 minutes on the phone with her and then said very carefully, "Marin, how well do you know the details of the 2012 IP acquisition from Caldwell Mosby?" "I don't," she said. "I assumed it was standard." "I'd recommend pulling the full file," he said. "All of it. And I'd recommend not discussing it with anyone at the company until you do." She'd pulled the file that evening. She'd been in her office until 1 in the morning reading it. Now she was sitting in a parking garage with a board meeting in 4 minutes, and the specific feeling of someone who has just discovered that the floor of a room they've been standing in for 2 years is significantly less solid than advertised. She made herself get out of the car. The board meeting was about quarterly projections and a licensing dispute with a European manufacturer, and Maureen sat through it performing the competence her position required, while a separate part of her mind kept returning to the documents she'd read the night before. Garrett Voss sat at the table in his usual position, to her right, close enough to pass notes during presentations, the geography of a trusted second-in-command. He was 54, professionally polished in the specific way of men who'd spent decades in corporate environments, with the kind of comfortable authority that came from years of being the person who actually understood the operational details while executives focused on vision. He'd been her father's COO. He'd been the person who'd walked her through the company's structure when she took over. He'd been, for 2 years, the person she trusted most inside this building. She watched him make a comment about the European licensing dispute and thought, "The 2012 acquisition agreements have your name on the authorization line." She didn't say anything. She wasn't ready to say anything. But she noticed, for what she was fairly certain was the first time, the specific quality of his comfort in this room. How completely at ease he was. How little effort competence seemed to require him. The ease of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction a long time ago and had been maintaining that arrangement ever since. After the meeting broke up, she stopped him in the hallway. "Garrett, the VP7 disposal. Did you handle the vendor selection personally?" He didn't miss a beat. "The team handled it. I signed off on the shortlist. Why?" "I'm just following up, making sure the timeline is on track." He smiled the smile of a man who was used to her checking on things. 30 days in the contract. Caldwell's shop is a small operation, but they've done disposal work for us before on legacy equipment. He paused. "You went out there yourself, right?" "I did." "Was there an issue?" "No," she said. "No issue." He nodded, already moving toward his next obligation. "I'll have the team send you the documentation requirements checklist if that would help." "That'd be fine," she said. She watched him walk away down the corridor and thought about 12 patents and a dissolved LLC and a mechanic who knew the number of a specific engine without being told. She drove back to Asheville on a Friday morning, unannounced. Holt heard the car before he saw it this time too, but the sound was different. A single vehicle, not an SUV convoy, and the engine note of something smaller and less armored. He was outside in the lot checking a tire pressure situation on a customer's Jeep when Maren Vron pulled in alone in a car that was still expensive but considerably less imposing than the last time, and got out without a driver. She was wearing different clothes this time. Still too nice for a garage, but calibrated differently, as if she'd thought about it and adjusted for something she couldn't quite name. "Ms. Vrain," he said, straightening up. "Mr. Caldwell." She looked at the shop, then at him. "I should have called ahead." "I'm not usually hard to find." A pause. The Jeep's owner, a woman named Petra who picked up her vehicle every Friday without fail, was watching from inside the waiting area with undisguised interest. Holt ignored this. "Can we talk inside?" Maren asked. He let her in. The engines were visible immediately. They always were now, dominating the back wall. Number 3 with the intake port cleaned and a new surface visible underneath where the rust had been carefully removed. Dell wasn't here today. He'd driven back to Knoxville for the weekend. The shop was quiet except for the radio Wren had left on before school, something upbeat that Holt kept meaning to change and kept forgetting to. Maren stopped in front of number 3 and looked at it for a long moment. She looked at it the way she hadn't looked at it the first time, with actual attention, rather than with the brisk inventory of a person who'd already made a decision. "You've been cleaning them," she said. "Yes. The contract specifies disposal." "I'm aware of the contract." She turned to look at him. Her expression was not the same as it had been last time either. Something had shifted in it. Not softer exactly, but more genuinely present, less defended by the layer of professional distance she'd worn like a coat the first visit. "I've been looking at some documents," she said. "Old records, patent filings from before my time with the company." Holt waited. "Caldwell Mosby Engineering," she said. "That was your company." "Was, yes." "You designed the VP7 program." Not a question. He answered it anyway. "I designed the powertrain systems. Dell Mosby handled fabrication methodology. We worked with a team of 12 engineers at Vrani's facility in Charlotte, but the core architecture was ours." He paused. "Your father knew that. He never pretended otherwise." She absorbed this without visibly reacting, which he suspected took more effort than she was showing. "But you left in 2012. "I was pushed out in 2012. "That's a different thing." "By who?" Holt looked at her steadily. She was 30 years old and had taken over a company she'd grown up at the periphery of and was standing in a mechanic's shop in Asheville asking questions that were going to cost her something, whatever answers she got. He found he couldn't be unkind to her, even though she'd called him a backwoods mechanic in the same room 2 weeks ago. She'd said it the way people say things when they're performing authority for an audience that includes themselves. "By people who decided that a licensing agreement that paid us a percentage of VP7 program revenue was more expensive than they wanted it to be," he said, "and who found ways to make the patent valuations look lower than they were, and the acquisition terms look fairer than they were, and who made it clear to both of us that the company's legal resources were significantly larger than ours, and that the process of fighting them was going to be longer and more expensive than we could sustain." He stopped. Your father tried to intervene. He was overruled. Marin was quiet for a moment. The radio was still playing something cheerful in the background. He was overruled, she repeated. He had a board. The board had been told a version of events. By the time he understood the full picture, the acquisition was done and I was gone. Garrett Voss, she said, quietly. Not accusatory, just placing something where it belonged. Holt didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. Your father called me twice after I left. I didn't take the calls. I was angry and I had a 2-year-old and I just... He stopped himself. That's a separate thing. He kept looking for you, Marin said. I found letters. In his study, in a box he never showed me. He'd written to an address in Tennessee, then one in Virginia, then somewhere in Georgia. He was trying to find you. She paused. He never found the Asheville address. The shop was very quiet for a moment. The radio went to a commercial and Holt reached over and turned it off. I moved around a lot the first couple years, he said. His voice came out level, which required some effort. I didn't want to be found. She nodded once, accepting this. Then she looked at the engines again. Number 3 with its cleaned casing, the intake port showing the original brushed aluminum finish beneath where the rust had been. Number 6 with the symmetrical casing Wren had admired. Number 1 with the foundry signature so small that only one person in the world knew where to look for it. I want to understand something, Marin said. When you asked me if I was sure about engine number 3, what did you already know? I knew what was inside it, Holt said. I built it. I know exactly what every one of these engines is capable of. And I knew that whoever sent them here for disposal either didn't know what they had or knew exactly what they had and wanted them gone for a different reason. He looked at her directly. I'm still not sure which one applies to you. She met his eyes and didn't look away. It applies to neither, she said. I was told they were obsolete prototypes with no commercial value. I believed it because I had no reason not to. And now? She looked at the engines. Now I think I was given an incomplete picture of a lot of things, she said, and I think these engines might be the least of it. Holt studied her for a moment. The set of her jaw, the particular tension around her eyes, the specific quality of someone who's just realized the scale of something and is holding it together by refusing to show what that realization costs. He thought about his father, who'd been a man who took people at face value and got hurt by it repeatedly and never fully stopped doing it. He thought about 2 years of being angry at everyone and then deciding to just fix cars and raise his daughter. You want to see what's inside number 3, he said. She looked at him, slightly surprised. Yes, she said. I do. He got his work gloves and pulled a second stool from against the wall and positioned it where she could see clearly. Then he began walking her through what he and Dell had found, not in the language of a presentation, but in the plain specific language of someone explaining work they'd done and cared about. He pointed at the valve configuration and described why it mattered. He explained the cooling channel geometry and what problem it solved that no one else had figured out how to solve cleanly in 2009. He showed her the crankshaft counterweight placement and what it did at 9,000 revolutions per minute when every other engine on the circuit was starting to lose its balance characteristics. She listened with the focused attention of someone who had grown up around engineering conversations, even if she hadn't been the engineer, and she asked good questions, not the questions of someone performing interest, but the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand something and was willing to show when she didn't. When Holt finally stopped talking and looked up, he realized they'd been at it for nearly 2 hours and the afternoon light had shifted in the high windows. Marin was looking at the engine with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Something that didn't have the professional layer over it. Something more like the look his daughter got when she understood something for the first time. How long to restore them? She asked. All 6. Depends on parts availability. Some of the original spec components aren't in production anymore. Dell knows sources, but it takes time. He considered. A year, maybe. Working weekends. And if you had resources, proper facility access, original tooling, a team? Holt looked at her carefully. That's a different conversation. I know, she said. I'm not ready to have it yet. I need to understand some things first. She stood up from the stool, brushing dust from her jacket with a slightly distracted motion that suggested she'd temporarily forgotten she was wearing something expensive. But I'd like to come back if that's acceptable. I'm usually here, he said. She moved toward the door, then stopped. The documents Voss used for the acquisition, she said, without turning around. The ones that undervalued the patents. Do you have copies of anything from that period? Your own records? He thought about a filing cabinet in the back office, the one he'd moved from 3 different residences over 6 years, the one he'd told himself he was keeping for no particular reason. Some, he said. I might need them. She said it carefully, the way someone says something they know is going to matter. If I find what I think I'm going to find, then you know where to find me, Holt said. She left without the composure she'd arrived with, or rather, she left with a different kind of composure, the kind that comes from having walked towards something difficult rather than away from it. Holt stood in the door of the shop and watched the car pull out of the lot and disappear around the corner toward the highway. Behind him, the 6 engines sat in their row. Number 3 gleamed where it had been cleaned, the aluminum catching the last of the afternoon light in a way that looked, if you were in a certain kind of mood, almost like it was waiting. Holt turned back inside and put his gloves on. He had work to do. Marin came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and by the 3rd week it had stopped feeling like official visits and started feeling like something she hadn't named yet, because naming it would require her to acknowledge that she was doing something other than conducting due diligence on a disposal contract she'd quietly decided to suspend. She told Nadia to hold her mornings on Tuesdays. She didn't explain why. The drive from Charlotte was 2 hours and 20 minutes, which gave her time to think through the documents she'd been pulling at night, the files she'd been reconstructing from the company's archive system while Voss was in meetings or traveling, accessing records under the general authorization her CEO position granted her without triggering the specific access logs that reported to his operational team. She discovered that particular detail, that Voss had a secondary monitoring layer on the archive system that flagged certain file categories when accessed. By accident, when Nadia had pulled a routine contract document and received an unusual system confirmation notice that neither of them had seen before. That was the moment Marin had understood the thing she'd been trying not to understand for 2 weeks. She hadn't said it out loud yet. Not to Nadia, not to Hargrove, who was still technically retired and was going to stay technically retired until she was ready to move. Not to anyone. She said it out loud for the first time on the 3rd Tuesday, sitting on the 2nd stool in Holt's shop with coffee going cold in her hand, while Del Mosby worked on the crankshaft journals of Number 4, and Holt was explaining a specific machining decision he'd made on the valve seats in 2009. Garrett Voss has been systematically pulling asset value out of the company, she said, in the middle of a sentence Holt was finishing about metallurgical specifications, which was not the right moment, but she'd been carrying it alone for long enough that it came out when the silence was quiet enough to hold it. Not catastrophically, not in ways that would trigger an audit red flag, small amounts from multiple streams over years, consulting fees to shell companies, equipment disposal contracts that were never executed at the price stated, parts acquisitions that didn't match the inventory logs. She stopped. These engines are the largest single instance I've found so far, but they're not the only one. Del put down the tool he was holding. Not loudly, just set it on the workbench with the controlled precision of a man who'd heard something that required stillness. Holt looked at her. His expression was the one she'd come to recognize over 3 weeks of Tuesday mornings, the one where he was listening fully and not yet responding, which was different from the silence of a person who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone deciding how much of what they were thinking to put into words. "How long?" he said. 7 years, maybe longer, depending on what I find in the older records. She looked at her coffee cup. He had access to everything. My father trusted him completely, and after my father got sick, Voss was managing most of the day-to-day without oversight. She paused. I was 28 when I came in. I didn't know what I didn't know. "You know now," Del said from the workbench without turning around. "I know part of it." She looked at Holt. The disposal contract for the engines. It was routed to a company called Meridian Asset Recovery. which doesn't exist in the way a company is supposed to exist. It has paperwork, it has an address, but the address is a mail forwarding service in Delaware, and the beneficial ownership traces back through 2 layers to an LLC that has a board of 2 people, one of whom is a lawyer I can't reach, and the other of whom, she stopped. Then, the other one is a private collector named Alstrom, who specializes in motorsport memorabilia. He has a facility in Arizona. He's paid above market prices for Vron prototype components at least 3 times in the past 5 years. Holt was very still. Voss was selling them to a collector. The disposal fees went to Meridian. The actual units went to Alstrom. She finally drank some of her coffee, which was cold. These engines were worth considerably more than scrap. He was getting paid twice. The company paid for disposal, and Alstrom paid for the merchandise. "So why send them here?" Dell said. He turned around now, leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular quality of someone doing arithmetic on a problem they don't like the shape of. If the pattern was working, why change it? Why route 6 VP7s to a mechanic shop in Asheville instead of directly to Arizona? It was the question Marin had been sitting with for a week. "I think someone in the logistics chain flagged them," she said. "The VP7 name still carries weight in the industry. If someone recognized what they were, they might have asked questions about sending 6 units directly to a private address. So the routing changed. Legitimate-looking disposal contract to a legitimate-looking small business, and then a secondary arrangement to collect them after disposal documentation was filed." She paused. "What I don't know is whether Voss knew your name was attached to the shop, whether that was deliberate." The shop was quiet enough that Holt could hear the sound of a car passing on the road outside. He thought about the shipping manifest he'd signed, the driver who'd arrived at 7:14 in the morning without calling ahead, the precision of the timing, the specific choice of his address. "Someone knew," he said. "Yes," Marin said. "I think so." "Which means there's someone in the logistics chain who has a longer memory than Voss was counting on," Dell said. "Or someone who wanted a record to exist," Holt said. "Someone who knew what these engines were and didn't want them to disappear quietly." Marin looked at him. "Your father tried to find you," she said. It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but she said it differently this time. Not as information, but as something that connected to what they were discussing, as if the 2 things were part of the same sentence. Holt didn't answer right away. He looked at number 3, the one that was furthest along in the restoration, the cleaned casing now showing the original finish along most of its length, the internal components disassembled and cataloged on the workbench in the specific order he always used. He thought about 2 phone calls he hadn't taken and a filing cabinet he'd moved across 3 states. "There's something I should show you," he said. Check. The back office of the shop was not a space Marin had seen before. It was small and slightly cluttered in the way of spaces that were used for actual work, rather than for appearing organized. A desk with a monitor that was a generation behind current, shelves of technical manuals organized with a precision that contrasted with everything else. A corkboard on the wall that held Wren's school schedule and a parts supplier contact list, and in the corner, a drawing Wren had done of the shop interior with the 6 engines visible along the back wall in careful 9-year-old perspective. The filing cabinet was the oldest thing in the room, 4 drawers, gray metal, with a small dent on the upper left corner that looked like it had been acquired in a move rather than in use. Holt pulled the bottom drawer and reached to the back and removed a manila folder that was thicker than it looked, the kind of thick that comes from years of periodic addition rather than from being assembled all at once. He set it on the desk in front of Marin. "These are my copies," he said, "of everything I had when I left. Patent applications, correspondence, the original licensing term sheets, and my own contemporaneous records. Emails I printed, meeting notes, the timeline of what happened with the acquisition." He paused. "I never used them. I kept them because I didn't know what else to do with them, and I couldn't make myself throw them away." Marin opened the folder and didn't speak for several minutes. She read the way she listened, with complete attention, going still except for her eyes, turning pages with the careful movements of someone handling something that mattered. Holt leaned in the doorway and watched her without making it obvious that he was watching her. "This correspondence," she said, without looking up, This is from my father. Yes. She was looking at a printed email, the formatting the kind that came from a desktop client circa 2011, the font slightly pixelated from age and printing. She read it again, then looked up at Holt. He told the board that the patent valuation was incorrect. He said the independent assessment had been influenced. She looked back at the email. He said he intended to renegotiate the acquisition terms with you directly. That email is from 2 weeks before the board voted to finalize the acquisition on the original terms, Holt said. He was overruled. And then I was presented with the final terms and told that the company's attorneys had concluded the original valuation was accurate and the original terms were the appropriate settlement. He paused. I didn't know about that email at the time. Your father sent it to me after the fact. By then I'd already signed. She set the email down and looked at the next document, which was a legal letter from Vrand's outside counsel, dense with the particular language of corporate lawyers who were confident their client had the larger budget. She put it down without finishing it and looked at Holt. He tried, she said. He tried, Holt said. He wasn't powerful enough inside his own company. That happens. He built the company. He built it with people who had their own interests. That also happens. He wasn't being unkind about it. It was just the way of things. The specific lesson that the corporate world taught everyone eventually, that the building of something and the controlling of something were two different skills with two different consequences. Marin closed the folder carefully. She put her hand flat on it for a moment, the way people sometimes put their hands on things they need to anchor themselves to. Then she looked up at Holt. I need these records, she said, for what comes next. I know, he said. Take them. She looked at him with an expression that was trying to be professionally neutral and wasn't quite managing it. I'm going to have to move carefully. If Voss suspects that I've found the pattern, he has enough access to the company's systems to create complications before I can complete the documentation. She paused. I also need to understand the full scope before I go to the board. If I move too early with incomplete evidence, he'll explain it away, and I'll lose the element of surprise and probably several board members who still trust him more than they trust me. How much more do you need? Dell asked from the workshop doorway, where he'd appeared at some point without either of them noticing. The Alstrom connection needs to be documented directly. I have the ownership chain, but not the transaction records. I need evidence of what was actually paid and when. She paused. And I need to understand how the VP7 disposal specifically was routed here. There's a logistics decision somewhere that I can't account for yet. Holt thought about that. Then, Dell. The engineer who signed off on the Charlotte facility closure in 2019. Peterson. He's still in the industry, isn't he? Dell's expression shifted in the way it did when he was putting two things together. Consulting for an outfit in Tennessee. We've talked a couple times. He paused. You think Peterson was the one who flagged the VP7s? I think someone with institutional knowledge of what those engines were decided they shouldn't go to Arizona. Someone with enough access to route the disposal to a different vendor, but not enough authority to stop the disposal entirely. Holt looked at Marin. If that's right, he might be willing to talk. She absorbed this. The folder was still under her hand. Can you reach him? Dell can, Holt said. It should come from Dell. Peterson and I didn't end well when I left Charlotte. Why? A pause. He thought I should have fought harder, taken them to court instead of walking away. Holt's voice was even. He wasn't wrong, exactly. But I had a 2-year-old and a wife who was sick, and I didn't have the years it would have taken. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way someone states a fact they've made peace with, but not entirely. I walked away. He never fully forgave me for it. The office was quiet. The technical manuals on the shelf were organized by year, oldest to newest, and the oldest ones went back to 2003, the year Holt had started at Vrand's Charlotte facility, fresh from an engineering program in North Carolina. Marin looked at the shelf and thought about a man who'd packed those books into boxes every time he moved and unpacked them in a new place and put them back in order, oldest to newest, as if the continuity of the arrangement was the thing he was maintaining when everything else was changing. I'm sorry, she said. About your wife. Holt looked at her. The expression was brief and complicated and then closed again. Her name was Claire, he said. She died the spring after Ren was born, before any of the other things happened. He paused. That's why I walked away. Not just the company. Everything. Marin didn't say she was sorry again. She'd said it, and he'd heard it, and saying it twice wouldn't make it land differently. Instead, she just held still in the way that people hold still when they've been told something real. Wren, she said after a moment. That's an unusual name. Claire's grandmother's name is, he said. Claire wanted it if we had a girl. A pause that was shorter than the previous one. We had a girl. Dell reached Peterson the following Thursday. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, which Dell reported to Holt afterward in the parking lot of the motel, standing by his truck in the cold because neither of them wanted to have the conversation inside the shop where it might be interrupted. Holt listened with his hands in his jacket pockets and the specific quality of stillness that meant he was processing something that mattered. Peterson had indeed been the one who rerouted the VP-7s. He'd been doing contract work for Vron's asset management division 18 months earlier, brought in to help catalog legacy equipment at the Charlotte facility, and he'd recognized the VP-7 blocks in a storage lot that was scheduled for Meridian asset recovery pickup. He'd pulled the original engineering documentation, confirmed what they were, and understood in roughly the same instant what their actual value was and what their routing to Meridian likely meant. He hadn't had enough standing to stop the disposal. He'd had enough access to substitute a different vendor on the processing order, Caldwell's Auto Repair, an address he'd found in an old industry directory that he'd put together with the name on the patent filings from memory, from years of memory, and file the paperwork before the Meridian pickup date. He wasn't sure you'd recognize them, Dell said. He thought maybe enough time had passed, but he figured if anyone would know what to do with them, it was you. Holt looked at the dark parking lot. The October cold had given way to something harder now, early November with a bite to it, the mountains visible in silhouette against a sky that still held some light in the west. Why didn't he call me? He said the same thing you said, that you two didn't end well. Dell paused. He also said he was scared. He'd been inside that facility. He knew what kind of resources Voss had access to. He figured a quiet reroute was one thing, but if his name got attached to any of it directly, he'd be exposed. Is he willing to talk to Marin? He said yes, but he wants immunity from any legal action Vron might take related to his unauthorized modification of the asset processing order. Dell paused. I told him I'd pass that along. I'll tell her. Holt was quiet for a moment. What else did he say? Dell hesitated, which was unusual enough that Holt looked at him directly. Dell was not a person who hesitated. He was a person who said things when he was ready to say them and was silent until then. He said he'd heard things, Dell said carefully, from other people who'd worked at the Charlotte facility about the company's financial irregularities. He said he'd been putting things together over the past year and he wasn't sure who to tell. A pause. He said the VP-7s were the most visible thing he'd found, but he thought they were also the least important thing. Holt stood with that for a moment. Meaning what? Meaning whatever Voss has been doing with the disposal contracts and the private collectors, that's small compared to something else. Something Peterson doesn't have direct evidence for, but has enough secondhand to make him nervous. Dell looked at the mountains. He wouldn't say what it was on the phone. He wants to meet in person. Marin drove to Knoxville on a Saturday. She took Nadia because she needed a witness to the conversation, and she left Nadia's name off the appointment because she didn't trust that Nadia's name wouldn't show up somewhere she didn't want it to show up. She drove herself rather than using a company car. She stopped at a gas station outside of Knoxville and sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes, doing nothing before she made herself get out and go inside for coffee she didn't really want. And then she drove to the address Dell had given Holt and parked on the street and sat for another 2 minutes. Nadia, in the passenger seat, said nothing. This was one of the things Marin valued most about her. Peterson turned out to be a thin man in his late 50s, with the permanently distracted air of someone whose mind was usually operating on a problem slightly removed from the conversation he was currently in. He met them at the door of the machine shop he'd been using for consulting work, a rented space, modest, with the organized surfaces of a man who respected tools, and he looked at Marin with the particular expression of someone who was reassessing a preconception in real time. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "People say that," she said. They sat at a work table with coffee Peterson had made in a machine that had seen better years, and Peterson talked for nearly 2 hours. He was methodical in the way engineers were methodical. He'd organized what he knew into a sequence, documented what he could, and was careful to distinguish between what he'd seen directly and what he'd been told by others who had. The larger thing, the thing Dell had anticipated, was this. Garrett Voss had not simply been diverting individual asset sales. He had, over a period of approximately 4 years, been systematically redirecting the revenue from Vrani's most valuable intellectual property licensing stream, not the VP7 program specifically, but the underlying manufacturing process patents that the VP7 program had generated, into a parallel structure that he controlled. The amounts were large enough that, if documented, they constituted not a compliance irregularity, but a fraud of a scale that implicated multiple financial reporting periods and potentially the company's audited statements. Marin sat through all of it without visibly reacting, which cost her more than it had ever cost her in any board meeting or investor call. When Peterson finished, she asked 3 questions. They were precise, specific questions, the kind that told Peterson, who was watching her with increasing respect, that she'd been doing her own work and had arrived at the same territory from a different direction. Then she said, "I need everything you have, documentation, correspondence, anything written, and I need you to be willing to provide a formal statement. With immunity from the asset rerouting." "Yes, I'll have Hargrove draft the agreement." She paused. "He was my father's counsel. You can trust him." Peterson looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to a filing cabinet in the back of the shop, gray metal, 4 drawers with a dent on the upper right corner, and came back with a manila folder. Marin looked at the folder and thought of Holt's filing cabinet in the back office of the shop in Asheville. "My father kept records too," she said, more to herself than to Peterson. "Your father was a careful man," Peterson said. "He just wasn't careful enough about who he trusted." She drove back to Charlotte that evening with the folder on the back seat and Nadia quiet in the passenger seat, and the particular feeling of someone carrying something heavy enough that they've stopped thinking about the weight and started thinking about where they're going to set it down. She called Holt when she was an hour out from Charlotte. He picked up on the second ring, which was becoming a pattern she'd noticed without commenting on. "Peterson talked," she said. "I know. Dell called me." A pause, the particular pause that meant he was not in the shop. Different acoustic quality. She'd learned to read the sounds of where he was by this point. "Are you okay?" The question surprised her, not because it was intrusive, but because it was simple and direct, and she hadn't expected it. Board members asked about her decisions. Lawyers asked about her documentation. Investors asked about her timeline. Nobody asked if she was okay. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I will be." "Yeah," he said. "You will." She drove the last hour in near silence with the radio on low, thinking about her father's letters to addresses in Tennessee and Virginia and Georgia, and a mechanic who'd moved across 3 states with a filing cabinet full of documents he couldn't throw away, and 6 engines sitting in a row in an Asheville shop getting cleaned back down to what they actually were underneath the rust. She came back the next Tuesday and the one after that, but by the 3rd Tuesday things had changed in a way that was hard to articulate. Holt noticed it first, which surprised him. He was not, by habit or inclination, someone who paid close attention to shifts in other people's behavior. He was better with machines than with people, and he'd always known it, and he'd made a kind of private peace with it over the years. But he noticed that Marin arrived earlier now. He noticed that she stopped checking her phone with the reflexive frequency of the first few visits. He noticed that she had started bringing something for Wren on Tuesday mornings. Not elaborate things, just whatever she'd passed on the way out of Charlotte, a specific kind of candy bar Wren had mentioned once, a small mechanical puzzle from a gas station that had taken Wren 40 minutes to solve and then made her insufferably pleased with herself. He noticed that Wren had started watching for Marin's car. He found that out on a Tuesday in mid-November when Wren, stationed at the shop window, ostensibly doing homework, said without looking up, "She's here. approximately 4 seconds before Marin's car appeared in the lot. Holt looked at his daughter. She had her mother's uncanny sense of the specific sounds of people she was paying attention to. He hadn't realized she'd been paying attention. "How do you always know?" he said. Wren glanced up from the homework with an expression that managed to combine 9-year-old condescension with genuine puzzlement at the question. "Her car sounds different than your customer cars," she said. "It's quieter." "Lots of cars are quiet. Hers is a different kind of quiet." She went back to the homework. "Also, it's Tuesday." Marin came in carrying a paper coffee cup for herself, and without making a production of it, a hot chocolate in a second cup that she set on the work table near where Wren was sitting. Wren said thank you without looking up, which was Wren's particular form of highest regard. She didn't perform gratitude, she just absorbed things and kept working. Marin looked at Holt with an expression he'd learned to read as meaning she had something to tell him that was significant. He tilted his head toward the back office. She followed him in. "I found the box," she said. He waited. "My father's study. There's a cabinet behind the bookcase. Not hidden exactly, but positioned in a way that I'd never had a reason to look behind the bookcase." She paused. "He used to sit in that study for hours. After he got sick, he'd spend entire afternoons in there. I thought he was reading." She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Holt. "He was building a case." The folder she pulled from her bag was thicker than the one Peterson had given her, thicker even than the one from Holt's filing cabinet. It was a collection assembled over years, printed documents, handwritten notes in her father's careful, precise handwriting, copies of financial records with margin annotations, a series of legal memoranda from an outside attorney whose name Marin didn't recognize and had already run down to a boutique firm in Washington that specialized in corporate fraud. Her father had known for at least 3 years. He had been documenting quietly, carefully, and alone, the way a man documents something when he understands that the people around him cannot be trusted with what he's finding. He was going to expose it, she said. He had enough. He was close. Her voice was steady because she'd had several days to absorb this. And then his heart attack, and then he was gone. And the box sat behind the bookcase in his study for 2 years while I sat across the hall not knowing it existed. Holt looked at the folder. "He was trying to bring you these engines," he said. "That's what the letters were about. He was trying to find me and restore what happened with the acquisition as part of documenting the larger pattern." "Yes." She met his eyes. "He wanted to make it right. Before he could expose Voss, he wanted to fix what Voss had done to you specifically, because you were the most direct victim of the most documented fraud." The office was quiet. The manual shelf was behind Marin, oldest to newest, 2003 to 2018. The corkboard had Wren's school schedule and the drawing of the shop interior with the 6 engines visible in the background, small but identifiable. "He was a good man," Holt said. "I know," Marin said. "I didn't always know how good." A pause. "I thought I knew him. I thought I understood what he built and why." She looked at the folder. "I didn't know he spent 3 years sitting alone in a study building a case that could have destroyed him if Voss had found out. I didn't know he was carrying that." "He was protecting you," Holt said. "He didn't want you inside it until he was sure." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm inside it now." "Yeah," he said. "You are." She looked at him with the expression that had no professional layer over it, the one that had been appearing more frequently over the past weeks. "Are you?" she said. "Inside it." He thought about that for a moment, seriously, the way the question deserved. He thought about 6 engines in a row along the back wall, and his daughter watching for a car she'd learned the sound of, and a folder he'd kept through 3 moves because he couldn't make himself throw it away. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Outside the office, in the workshop, Wren was explaining something to the empty room in the tone she used when she was talking to herself while working, a running commentary that he'd heard since she was 4 years old and that still made something warm move in his chest when he caught it from a distance. The engines sat in the bay in their row. Number 3 was nearly ready for a first assembly test. Number 1 and number 2 were fully disassembled, their components organized on the workbench in the order they'd come apart, waiting to go back together. Holt held the door to the back office and looked at Marin and thought, some things get buried long enough that when you finally dig them up, you're not sure whether to call it recovery or excavation. He was starting to think it might be both. The first test assembly of engine number 3 happened on a Thursday evening in late November, with no ceremony and no audience except Dell and Wren, who had positioned herself on the shop stool with her homework open in her lap, but her eyes tracking every move Holt made across the bay. It had taken 11 weeks to get here. 11 weeks of sourcing components that weren't in production anymore, of calling contacts Dell still had at specialty machine shops in 4 states, of fabricating 2 replacement parts on the manual lathe that Holt had bought secondhand 7 years ago and maintained with the same care he gave the VP7S themselves. The cylinder sleeves had needed regrinding. The main bearing journals had required a level of surface finishing that pushed the limits of what the shop's equipment could do. And there had been a Tuesday in October when Holt had stood in front of number 3 at 11 at night and understood that he was going to have to either acquire better tooling or accept a compromise he wasn't willing to accept. He hadn't accepted the compromise. He'd spent 3 days locating a precision grinding service in Roanoke, driven the crankshaft up there himself with Wren in the passenger seat, asking questions about everything they passed on the highway, and driven back with the shaft finished to the specification he'd written in 2009 and not looked at since. Now number 3 was assembled, not installed in anything, not running, just assembled. All its components torqued to spec, the valve train set, the timing aligned to the marks Holt had made on the sprockets with a scribe 15 years ago in a Charlotte facility that no longer existed in its original form. He stood back and looked at it. "It looks different put together," Wren said from the stool. "Everything does," Dell said. He was wiping his hands on a shop towel, which was the closest Dell got to showing satisfaction with a completed task. "Can we run it?" Wren asked. "Not tonight," Holt said. "Not here. We need a proper test setup." He paused. "And we need Marin." Wren accepted this without pushback, which told him she understood it mattered, that this was not just a mechanical milestone, but something larger that she'd absorbed through 11 weeks of Tuesday mornings, and the specific way the adults in the shop talked around each other. Holt called Marin at 9:30 that night. She answered on the first ring, which was new. "Number 3 is assembled," he said. A pause, brief. "When can we run it?" "I need a dyno. The shop doesn't have one. Dell knows a facility in Mooresville that owes him a favor. Closed environment, discreet, the kind of place that tests equipment without asking what it's for." "When?" "December. We need 2 weeks minimum to arrange the setup properly." He paused. "There's something else. Before we run it, I need to know where things stand on your end. If we produce performance data on a VP7 and it becomes known, and it will become known, that kind of number doesn't stay quiet, then we're announcing something. To the industry, to collectors, and to Voss." A longer pause this time. He could hear her moving, the sound of footsteps on a hard floor, the particular acoustic of a large space. Her house, he guessed. He'd never been there, but he'd constructed a rough picture from context. "I've completed the documentation," she said. "The full pattern. Peterson's materials, my father's records, the financial forensics my outside firm finished last week." She paused. "It's enough. More than enough." "Then what are you waiting for?" "The right moment," she said, "and I want to be honest with you about what that means." He waited. "I want the engine running first," she said. "I want something tangible that shows what was actually buried. Not just financial records. Those are abstract. Numbers on paper. The board will see them and understand the fraud intellectually, but it won't." She stopped, searching for the word. "It won't land the right way. Voss will have lawyers in that room within 24 hours, and the lawyers will make it complicated and technical, and the board will start to hedge." Another pause. "But if the engine is running, if there's a physical demonstration of what was taken and what it's still worth, then the fraud has a face. It has a sound." Holt was quiet for a moment. He understood what she was saying. He also understood what she wasn't saying, which was that she'd been thinking about the sequence carefully, methodically, with the specific kind of intelligence that planned 3 steps ahead while appearing to be responding to the present moment. "You're not just building a legal case," he said. "No," she said. "I'm building something the board can't walk away from." He thought about that. Then, "Okay, Mooresville, 2 weeks. I'll clear my schedule," she said. A pause settled between them that was comfortable in the way pauses between two people become comfortable after enough of them have accumulated. He was sitting on the crate in the shop, the assembled number 3 visible across the bay, the overhead light making the cleaned aluminum casing catch and reflect. "Holt," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for not destroying them." "They were mine," he said simply. "I wasn't going to destroy them." He heard her exhale, something that might have been a small laugh, or might have been something else. "Good night," she said. "Night," he said, and hung up, and sat with the assembled engine for another 10 minutes before he turned off the light and went inside. The week before the Mooresville test, Voss made his move. Holt didn't know that was what was happening at first. He knew that a man in a dark blue rental sedan had been parked on the road outside the shop for 2 mornings in a row, visible through the high window above the workbench when the angle of the morning light was right. He knew because Wren mentioned it first. She noticed cars, their sounds, and their positions, with the same instinctive tracking she brought to everything in her environment. And then he confirmed it himself by walking to the end of the lot on an errand pretext and getting close enough to see that the car had a temporary tag and the man inside it was not looking at his phone the way people look at their phones when they're waiting for someone. He was looking at the shop. Holt called Dell. Then he called Marin. "He knows something," she said immediately. The controlled neutrality in her voice was doing more work than usual. "Or someone told him something. How long has the car been there?" "This is the 2nd morning. Did you get a plate?" "Partial. Dell's running it through a contact." "Holt!" Her voice shifted slightly, dropping the operational quality for just a moment. "If Voss knows you have the engines and that I've been coming to Asheville, he'll try to establish that we've been coordinating. He'll frame it as a conspiracy against the company rather than the other way around." "I know." "Which means we need to move the timeline up." He'd been thinking the same thing since he'd seen the car the first morning. "The dyno's not ready." "Is the engine ready?" "Number 3 is assembled. We haven't verified torque under load. We haven't—" "Holt." She said his name the specific way she'd developed over the past weeks. Not soft, but bshkidet. The way you say someone's name when you need them to hear the specific sentence. "Is the engine mechanically ready to run?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "It'll run." "Then we run it next week instead of 2 weeks. I'll tell Nadia to reschedule the board meeting to the following Monday." A pause. "I need you to be there, at the board meeting, with documentation, and with Dell, and with everything in that filing cabinet." "I'm not a Wren employee," he said. "I have no standing at a board meeting." "You will by Monday," she said. "I'm restoring the original licensing terms retroactively as a corrective action under my CEO authority. Hargrove has prepared the documentation, which means you'll have standing as a principal party to an active licensing agreement, and that means I can compel your presence as a material witness." He sat with that for a moment. The full weight of what she'd arranged, quietly, over the past weeks, settled around him in the specific way of things that have been in motion longer than you realized. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "Since October," she said. "Since the 2nd Tuesday." He thought about the 2nd Tuesday. She'd arrived slightly earlier than the first time and asked 3 specific questions about the internal configurations of the VP7S. At the time, he'd read it as growing genuine interest. He hadn't considered that she might also be constructing an argument. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "I'll see you Thursday." The Mooresville facility was a low building set back from the road, the kind of building that didn't advertise what happened inside it. Dell's contact was a compact, precise man named Wexler, who had worked in motorsport development for 30 years and had the specific quality of someone who had seen enough extraordinary things that he had become very difficult to impress. He was visibly impressed when they uncrated number 3. "VP7, he said, not a question. "Yes," Holt said. "I've seen dyno data on the original VP7, from 2011. Wexler walked around the engine slowly. Tested one of the customer spec versions at a facility in Michigan. This isn't a customer spec, Holt said. This is the original prototype configuration, the one the customer spec was derived from. Wexler looked at him. Who are you? He built it, Dell said from near the door. Wexler looked at Holt with a different kind of attention then. Caldwell? He said slowly. Something clicked behind his eyes. You're Caldwell. Yeah. I read the engineering notes on the VP7 program, the original internal documentation, back when I was with the circuit. He paused. I always thought the guy who wrote those notes had left the industry. I did, Holt said. Temporarily. Wexler turned back to the engine. Let's see what she does, he said. They installed number 3 in the dyno stand over the course of 3 hours, and the process was not smooth. The mounting adapters required modification. A coolant line fitting turned out to be one size off the standard configuration, and Wexler had to fabricate a reducer on site. And there was a 40-minute period when a fuel system pressure reading was inconsistent, and Holt and Dell went through the entire delivery circuit twice before finding a loose connection at the secondary rail. By the time they were ready to attempt a first start, it was past 4 in the afternoon, and the light outside had gone gray and flat. Marin had arrived at noon and had spent the afternoon between watching the installation and sitting at a work table in the corner with Nadia, going through documents on a laptop with the focused efficiency of people who were preparing for something that had a hard deadline. Wren had come because it was a school day, with a late start, and Holt hadn't been willing to leave her with a neighbor. She was on her 3rd drawing of the afternoon, this one of the dyno stand, capturing the geometry of the mounting frame with more accuracy than she had any particular reason to have. Ready? Wexler said. Holt looked at the engine, at the fuel connections and the coolant lines and the ignition harness and the exhaust stubs pointing into the dyno cell's extraction system. At the aluminum casing cleaned back to its original finish, the casting numbers legible, the engineering marks he'd made 15 years ago still present in the metal where the chemistry of the cleaning process had revealed them. Yeah, he said. Ready. The start sequence was manual. No electronic management system, just the original mechanical fuel delivery and the direct ignition that the prototype configuration had used before the production versions were adapted for modern electronics. Wexler handled the controls. Holt stood outside the cell glass with his arms crossed and watched. The engine turned over twice and fired. The sound it made in the enclosed cell was something between physical sensation and noise. A low, dense, authoritative sound that was nothing like the consumer experience of automotive engines and everything like what Holt had built it to be. Wexler brought it up through the idle range carefully, watching temperatures, watching pressures, watching the behavior of an engine that had been sitting disassembled for years being asked to be what it was built to be. It was what it was built to be. At 5 minutes, Wexler looked through the cell glass at Holt, with an expression that Holt recognized as a man recalibrating. He brought the engine up further. The numbers on the dyno readout built steadily, without the hesitation or the rough patches that cold machinery typically showed. Number 3 ran like it had been tested yesterday. At the full load pull, Wexler stepped back from the controls and looked at the readout for a long moment. Then he looked at Holt. These numbers are not possible, he said, from a 15-year-old engine. They're possible, Holt said. I designed them to be possible. Wexler looked at the readout again, then at the engine, then at Holt. This exceeds the published performance figures from the original 2011 test data. The published figures were from the customer spec configuration, Holt said. The customer spec was a detuned version for regulatory compliance. This is the original prototype. It was never published. Wexler absorbed this. Behind them, Marin had come to stand beside Holt at the cell glass. She was looking at the readout, and her expression was the one Holt had seen the first time she'd looked at the inside of number 3 in his back office. Not triumph, but something more honest than triumph. The expression of someone who has seen a thing confirmed that they needed to be confirmed. Record everything, she said to Wexler. Full documentation package, chain of custody, test protocols, all of it. Already am, Wexler said. Wren appeared at Holt's elbow and looked through the glass at the running engine. It was still at load, the sound filling the cell with its particular frequency. She watched it for a moment with her hands pressed against the glass. "That's yours," she said, not looking up at him. A statement, not a question. "Yeah," he said. "It sounds different than the other ones we run." What does it sound like? She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to questions she considered important. "Like it's been waiting," she said. "What?" The board meeting was at 10 on Monday morning. Marin had called it as a special session, agenda listed as operational review and executive performance assessment, which was standard enough language that it generated no particular alarm. She'd spent the weekend reviewing every document one final time, preparing the sequence of presentation with the specificity of someone who understood that boards were political bodies before they were oversight bodies, and that the order in which information was delivered mattered as much as the information itself. She'd also called each board member individually on Saturday. Not to preview the content, she wasn't ready for the content to exist in any channel she didn't control, but to gauge, through the texture of those conversations, who was positioned where. There were 7 board members. 3 she was certain of, 2 she believed she could bring with the right evidence. One was Voss's explicit ally, placed on the board 3 years ago through a nomination that she now understood more fully. One was genuinely unknown. That left her needing the 2 she believed and the unknown, which was the kind of math that left no margin. She'd told Holt all of this on Sunday evening. They were at the shop, both of them too occupied with their own preparations to be anywhere else. Wren asleep in the office on the couch that had been there since before Holt bought the building, covered with the blanket she kept there for the nights when Holt worked late and didn't want to wake her moving her home. "You have the votes?" he said. "I think so. I don't know." She was sitting at the workbench, a legal pad in front of her covered in her handwriting. The unknown board member is a woman named Ostergaard. She's been on the board 6 years. She came in through the engineering side, not the finance side. She has a background in manufacturing. "Then show her the engine data first," Holt said. Marin looked at him. "Engineers respond to demonstrated performance," he said. "Before the financial case, before the legal documentation, show her the dyno results. Let that land first. Then she's already on your side when the fraud evidence comes out, because she understands what was taken." Marin looked at the legal pad. Then she crossed something out and rewrote it above the line. "That's actually right," she said. "I know about engineers," he said, "for obvious reasons." She looked up at him with something that wasn't quite a smile but existed in the same vicinity. "Will you be nervous tomorrow?" she said. "No," he said, which was mostly true. He'd been nervous about things that were uncertain. Tomorrow wasn't uncertain. It was simply something that needed to happen, and he was going to be there for it, and that was the whole of the calculation. "I will be," she said, which surprised him with its directness. "You'll be fine," he said. "You don't know that. You've been building this case for 2 months while running a company, and none of the people around you knew what you were doing," he said. "You'll be fine." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the legal pad. "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep." "Wren's already asleep in the office." "Then go get some sleep in the office," she said. "I'll lock up when I leave." He looked at her, this woman who had arrived at his shop 2 months ago in clothes too nice for a garage to tell him to destroy his life's work, sitting at his workbench at 11 at night revising the order of a board presentation. He thought about the specific distance between those 2 moments and what had happened in it, and he thought it was probably the most honest version of how things actually changed. Not in dramatic revelations, but in accumulated Tuesdays, in coffee going cold, in the sound of an engine that had been waiting. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said, without looking up. Garrett Voss arrived at the board meeting at 9:58, 2 minutes early, which was his habit. He was carrying his usual leather folder, wearing his usual expression of controlled authority, and he took his usual seat at the right side of the table. He registered Holt's presence in the room with a flicker that lasted less than a second before his face reassembled itself. Dell was there too, sitting beside Holt, and Nadia at the far end with a laptop open. Wexler's documentation was in a printed packet at every board member's place, along with a second packet that none of the board members had opened yet. Voss looked at Marin. "Who are the guests?" he said, with the tone of a man who already knew and was deciding how to handle knowing. Material witnesses, she said, under the terms of the corrective licensing agreement executed Friday. She paused. You'll want to read the packets. He opened his and read the first 2 pages without visible expression. Then he looked up. This is a unilateral action outside your authority as CEO, he said. The board would need to ratify. Section 14 of the corporate charter grants the CEO authority to execute corrective agreements in cases of documented prior misconduct affecting company interests, Marin said. Hargrove drafted the action. It's referenced in the packet. Voss looked at the third board member to his right, the one he'd placed, who was already reading and whose expression was giving him nothing useful. I'd like to understand the basis for the claim of prior misconduct, Voss said. His voice was even. His hands on the table were very still. I'll walk you through it, Marin said, starting with the VP7 acquisition in 2012. What followed took 90 minutes. Marin presented it in the sequence she'd built, the engineering history first, Wexler's dyno data, and Holt's technical documentation, which landed exactly as Holt had predicted on Ostergaard, who was leaning forward in her chair by the end of the first 15 minutes. Then the patent records, the acquisition terms, the evidence of the valuation manipulation, then the Meridian asset recovery structure and the Alstrom transactions, then the broader licensing revenue diversion, the parallel financial structure, 4 years of systematic extraction documented to the invoice level by the forensic firm Marin had retained. Holt spoke twice, when asked specific questions by board members, both times briefly and factually, without editorializing. Dell spoke once, to confirm the technical specifications of the VP7 program and his own direct knowledge of the 2012 acquisition circumstances. Voss's lawyer, reached by phone, sitting in by conference line within the first 30 minutes, objected 3 times. Marin addressed each objection by citing the specific document that answered it. At 11:40, the board chair, a quiet man named Branson, who'd been with the company 12 years, asked Voss directly, Garrett, is any of this inaccurate? Voss sat with the question for a long moment. His hands on the table were still. His expression had gone through several phases in the past 90 minutes and had arrived somewhere that was not quite composure, but was holding the shape of it. I'd like the opportunity to respond with my own documentation, he said. This has been a one-sided presentation. The documentation presented is the company's own financial records, Marin said, from systems you have administrative access to. If your documentation contradicts it, I'd like to see that too. Another silence. The conference line was quiet. Branson looked at the board. Then he called for a 15-minute recess. In the hallway during the recess, Holt stood at a window that looked out over the Charlotte skyline, a view he hadn't seen in 12 years and which had changed enough to be unfamiliar in the specific way of places where time has visibly passed. Dell was beside him, coffee from the building's cafeteria, not talking because Dell understood that this was not a moment that required talking. Marin came out of the boardroom and stood on his other side. She was holding her legal pad, its surface covered now in the crossouts and revisions and margin notes of 90 minutes of delivered argument. Ostergaard asked to see the dyno printout twice, she said. I noticed, Holt said. She's going to vote for removal. I know. A pause. Below them, Charlotte went about its business in the particular way of cities that don't slow down for anything happening in their office buildings. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Not performatively, just plainly, the way she'd learned to say things over the past 2 months. You don't have to, he said. This was mine too. It was yours first, she said. He looked out at the skyline and thought about that, about first claims and what they meant after enough time had passed, about 6 engines in a row and a daughter who noticed cars by their sound, and a filing cabinet that had traveled across 3 states because he couldn't let the record disappear. Let's go back in, he said. She nodded. They went back in. The vote to suspend Garrett Voss pending full investigation was 5-1, with 1 abstention. The abstention was Voss's placed board member, who abstained rather than voted against, which Marin noted as significant information for a conversation she'd have later. The one vote against was Voss himself, who, as an executive officer, had non-voting board attendance rights. and who apparently had not been fully informed about those limitations until Branson quietly clarified the matter. After the vote, after the formal language was concluded and the room had begun the specific process of ending a meeting whose weight everyone in it could feel, Holt looked at Dell across the table. Dell looked back. Neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything that needed to be said, and they'd always communicated better in the absence of words anyway. Then Holt looked at the window, at the Charlotte skyline, at the gray December sky above it. Somewhere in Asheville, in a shop that smelled like oil and old coffee and engine metal, 5 more VP7s were waiting. He thought about Wren's drawing of the shop interior, the 6 engines visible in the background in careful 9-year-old perspective, and about what she'd said at the glass of the dyno cell. It sounds like it's been waiting. Yeah, he thought. It had been. The weeks after the board vote were not clean. That was the first thing Holt would have told anyone who asked him what it was like, and nobody asked him directly, which was fine, but the cleanness myth was the thing that bothered him most when he read the coverage later. The way the financial press condensed 3 months of complicated, grinding, frequently uncertain work into a narrative arc with a satisfying shape that the actual experience had not possessed. Voss didn't go quietly. That had never been a realistic expectation, but the specific texture of how he didn't go quietly was something Marin had to manage in real time, without a script, often without sleep. His lawyers filed 2 separate injunctions in the first week after the vote, both aimed at blocking the corrective licensing agreement on procedural grounds, both arguing that Marin had exceeded her CEO authority in a manner that constituted a breach of her own fiduciary duty. The arguments were not meritless. They were crafted by people who were very good at finding the exact edges of corporate governance language. And Hargrove spent 17 days in a posture Marine described to Holt on the phone as a 73-year-old man running on spite and constitutional principle, which Hargrove, when she repeated it to him, took as a compliment. The forensic investigation expanded. What had started as a pattern Marin had traced through the asset disposal system grew outward the way these things always do when people with access and motive start looking seriously. Into vendor relationships, into contract terms, into the specific decisions that had shaped Vraughn's capital allocation over nearly a decade. The external firm brought in additional staff. A regulatory inquiry was initiated by a securities body that had received, from a source Marin never definitively identified but had strong suspicions about, an anonymous complaint with supporting documentation that tracked closely with what her father's box had contained. Dell drove back to Knoxville in the second week of December. He had his own work, his own obligations, the consulting practice that had kept him occupied for 12 years of Holt not calling. He came back to Asheville twice more before the end of the year, and both times the visits were about the remaining engines. Numbers 1 and 2 had been fully disassembled during November, their components cataloged, their condition assessed, the specific deficiencies noted, and the sourcing plans drafted. Numbers 4, 5, and 6 were further behind, still in the cleaning and inspection phase, their restoration timelines dependent on parts availability and on how much time Holt could give them around the shop's regular work, which didn't stop because a billion-dollar legal situation had developed on the periphery of his life. Curtis still brought his Silverado in. Petra still picked up her Jeep on Fridays. A college student named Marcus had started bringing in a Honda that had been maintained with the specific neglect of someone who had other priorities, and Holt worked on the Honda with the same attention he gave everything because the work was the work regardless of what else was happening. Wren noticed the difference in him. She always noticed things, but this was a particular noticing. One evening in December, she looked up from her homework at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "You seem less tired." Holt looked up from the invoice he was reviewing. "Yeah? You used to be more tired." She considered this, chewing on the end of her pencil in the way he'd been trying to break her of for 2 years. Like even when you weren't doing anything, you were still tired. He thought about that. About the specific quality of tiredness that comes not from exertion, but from containment, from holding something compressed for long enough that the compression itself becomes the exhausting thing, and you forget there was ever anything inside it. He said. "I'm working on it." She went back to her homework. Then, a minute later, "Is Marin coming Tuesday?" "I think so." "Yes." She nodded and kept writing. The first Tuesday in January, Marin arrived at the shop to find Holt on the phone in the lot, standing with his back to the road the way he stood when a call required concentration. She parked and waited without getting out of the car, watching him through the windshield, and thought about how much she'd learned to read in his posture over the past 3 months. The specific set of his shoulders when he was working through a problem versus when he was receiving information he didn't like versus when he was deciding something. This was the deciding posture. Whatever the call was, he was arriving at a position while it was still ongoing. He hung up and looked at the car, and she got out. "Alstrom," he said. "The collector in Arizona. He's cooperating with the regulatory inquiry. Full transaction records." He paused. Every unit Voss sold him over 5 years. 11 transactions. She absorbed this. That's the chain of custody for the full pattern. That's the chain of custody for everything. He looked at her steadily. "It's done, Marin. They have what they need." She stood in the cold January lot and let that land. It had been building toward this for months, and she'd known it was coming. And knowing something is coming doesn't always prepare you adequately for the moment it arrives. She felt it settle through her the way heavy things settle. Not dramatically, just with weight, with the specific gravity of finality. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They stood in the lot for a moment in the cold, and neither of them said anything, and that was fine. But the formal legal proceedings against Voss were initiated in February. Marin didn't attend the filing in person. Her lawyers attended, Hargrove attended, the regulatory body had its own representation, and she spent that morning at the shop instead, which was where she'd been spending Tuesday mornings for 4 months, and which had become, without either her or Holt acknowledging it formally, a fixed point in the shape of her week. She told him about it when she arrived. He was underneath a customer's truck, visible only from the knees down, and he slid out when he heard her car. "It's filed," she said. He wiped his hands on the shop rag. "How do you feel?" "Strange," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel something cleaner than this." "What do you feel?" She thought about it. Tired and relieved, and also like there's a lot still to do, which makes the relief feel premature. She paused. "And sad, which doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," he said. "Your father built something and it was broken from inside, and now the breaking is being addressed legally. That's not uncomplicated." He put the rag in his back pocket. "You're allowed to feel more than one thing." She looked at him. He'd said it plainly, without the particular softening that people usually applied to statements like that, the verbal equivalent of a cushion. Just stated it as a fact, which was how he stated most things, and which she'd come to understand was not coldness, but a specific form of respect. He didn't cushion things for her because he didn't think she needed cushioning, and she'd realized over the months that no one in her professional life had ever treated her that way consistently. "The board has asked me to present a restoration plan," she said, "for the company. The financial remediation, the restructuring." She paused. "They've also asked me to present a plan for the VP7 program. What to do with what we have." Holt looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do with what we have?" She'd been thinking about this since December. Since the dyno test, since the sound of number 3 running in Wexler's cell had made Ostergaard lean forward in her chair and made Wexler look at Holt with the specific expression of someone recalibrating what they thought was possible. "I want to run them," she said, "the way they were built to be run." "Racing?" "There's an endurance circuit that's been trying to bring heritage technology classes into its format for 3 years. Period correct machinery, original specifications. The VP7 is the most significant undeployed engine in that period's history." She paused. "Every team in that class would want one. The licensing revenue would be substantial, but that's not—" She stopped and restarted. "That's not actually why I want to do it." "I know," he said. "I want to do it because my father would have wanted to do it," she said. "He loved the engineering. He loved what those engines represented about what the company was capable of. Before everything else happened, that's what Vrani Motors was. He would have wanted to see them run." Holt looked at the shop door. Through it, across the bay, the row of engines was visible. Number 3 complete, numbers 1 and 2 in their reassembly phases, the remaining 3 in various stages of restoration along the back wall. 6 engines that had spent years being treated as problems, and that were, under all of that, exactly what they'd always been. Dell and I would need a proper facility, he said. The shop isn't equipped for the final assembly and testing phase at race spec. We'd need the right dyno setup, the right calibration equipment. The Charlotte facility has the space, she said. We'd need to refit the powertrain lab, but the structure is there. I've had the building team walk it already. He looked at her. You've been planning this for a while. She almost smiled. Since January, she said, borrowing your line. He was quiet for a moment, then, Holt Caldwell doesn't put his name on anything associated with Vrana Motors unless the terms are right. I know, she said. I have Hargrove working on the terms. I'm going to want Dell involved. I assumed. And I'm not moving to Charlotte. The shop stays open. Whatever this is, it's in addition to what I already do, not instead of it. I wouldn't ask you to close the shop, she said, and she meant it, because she understood by now what the shop was. It wasn't just the business, it was the structure he'd built around himself and his daughter when everything else had been taken or lost. And you didn't ask someone to dismantle that even when you were offering them something better, because better and right were different categories and the shop was right. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Dell, when Holt called him that evening, said, about time, and then asked 3 specific technical questions about the Charlotte facility's power supply infrastructure, and Holt answered them, and that was how that conversation went. The restoration of all 6 VP7s took until September. It was not a smooth process. Number 4 had internal damage that hadn't been apparent from the initial inspection, a cracked cylinder wall discovered during the bore measurement phase, that required sourcing a replacement casting from a retired foundry contact of Dell's who spent 2 weeks looking for the original tooling before locating it in a storage unit in Ohio. Number 5 had a crankshaft with a fatigue crack, visible only under magnetic particle inspection, discovered the morning Dell had planned to begin journal grinding, which set that engine back by 6 weeks. Number 6, the one with the symmetrical casing that Wren had declared the best looking, went together almost perfectly, which Dell said was suspicious, and Holt said was just how it sometimes went, and Dell said that was not a scientific attitude. And they had the specific argument that people who have worked together for years have, where neither of them is wrong, and both of them know it. Wren came to the Charlotte facility on school breaks and spent her time between observing the work and occupying the office Marin had set aside, a corner room with a view of the testing bay that Wren had immediately identified as the best spot in the building, which Holt suspected Marin had known when she assigned it. She did her homework there and drew there, and occasionally asked Marin questions with the direct, unprefaced quality of someone who'd decided a person was worth asking. Did you always want to run a company? She asked once, on a March afternoon when Marin was reviewing specifications at the desk beside her. Marin looked up from the documents. No, she said. I wanted to design things. When I was young. What kind of things? Structures. Buildings. She paused. I was good at understanding how things fit together. What held what up. Why didn't you? A pause that was slightly longer. My father needed someone, she said, after he got sick. And I was there. And I understood the company. And it seemed like the right thing to do. Wren thought about this with the seriousness she gave to answers she was actually processing. Do you like it, running the company? Some of it, Marin said honestly. More of it now than before. She looked at the testing bay window where Holt and Dell were visible, moving around number 5's assembly stand. I like this part, this specific part. Wren followed her gaze. Then she went back to her drawing, which was of the testing bay, with 2 figures near an engine assembly that Holt, looking at it later, recognized as himself and Dell, rendered with the slightly elongated proportions of her style, but identifiable, positioned the way they actually stood when they were working. He found the drawing on the corner of her desk and held it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his chest pocket, next to the shop rag he always kept there. The circuit announced the Heritage Class format in August, with Vrana Motors as the founding technology partner and the VP7 as the flagship engine. The press covered it with the specific energy of automotive journalism encountering a story that had everything it wanted: a lost legend, a family company's redemption, a fraud exposed, engines that shouldn't still be relevant being demonstrably, measurably relevant. They wanted Holt on camera. He said no 3 times before Marin stopped relaying the requests, understanding that this was not negotiable and not worth continuing to ask about. He wasn't interested in the camera. He was interested in whether the engines ran correctly and whether the teams who licensed them understood what they had and how to use it. The first team to take delivery of a race-spec VP7 was a small operation out of Virginia called Half Track Motorsport. 2 brothers named Gable, who'd been racing in heritage classes for 6 years on a budget that required them to rebuild everything themselves. They arrived at the Charlotte facility on a Thursday morning in late September with a truck and a trailer and the specific energy of people who couldn't quite believe they were getting what they were getting. The older Gable brother, first name Lee, with the kind of handshake that meant he'd worked with his hands his whole life, looked at the engine on the crating stand and then at Holt and said, "You actually built this thing?" "Yeah," Holt said. "In 2010. "This specific one, yes. Number 2. Lee Gable looked at the engine for a long moment. "My father used to watch the races when your engines were running, said he'd never heard anything like it." He paused. "He passed 8 years ago." Holt looked at the engine, then at Lee Gable. "Tell me what class you're entering," he said. "I want to give you the setup notes for the configuration." They spent 2 hours in the facility's conference room, Holt walking the Gable brothers through every operational characteristic of the VP7 in race conditions, the specific behaviors at temperature, the tuning sensitivities, the things the data didn't tell you that only the builder knew. Lee Gable took notes with the focused attention of someone who understood that what he was being given had a value that couldn't be invoiced. When they were loading out, Marin was in the lot, watching the engine being secured in the trailer. She was standing with her arms crossed against the September cool, and Holt came to stand beside her. "Number 2, she said. "Number 2, he said. "How many more?" 5 teams have confirmed licensing, 2 more in negotiation." He paused. "By spring, we could have all 6 in competition." She was quiet for a moment. "My father would have—" She stopped. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." She didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't press her to, because some sentences don't need their ending spoken to be fully understood. The championship race was in November, at a circuit in the hills of Western Virginia that the Heritage Series had chosen for its layout: long straights, technical corners, the kind of track that rewarded engine character over raw output, which the VP7 had always had in abundance. Holt drove up on Friday with Wren in the passenger seat, the same position she'd occupied on the trip to the Roanoke grinding shop 14 months earlier, asking fewer questions this time, but with the same quality of attention, watching the landscape with the particular alertness of someone storing things. Dell was already there when they arrived, having come up from Knoxville the previous evening. He was in the paddock with Lee Gable's crew looking at the setup on car number 17, Half Track's entry, which had qualified 3rd, which was the best result the Gable brothers had ever achieved in 6 years of racing, and wearing the expression he wore when he approved of how something had been executed. Marin arrived Saturday morning. She came into the paddock with Nadia and found Holt and Wren at the pit wall watching a practice session and sat down on the other side of Wren without ceremony, the way you sit beside people you've been sitting beside for long enough that the placement has become natural. Wren leaned slightly into her, unconsciously, in the way she leaned into people she trusted. Marin noticed it and didn't comment on it, just adjusted her position to accommodate it and continued watching the cars. Holt noticed all of this from the corner of his attention and said nothing. The race on Sunday was 3 hours. Number 17 started 3rd, lost a position in the first corner sequence to a faster qualifier who'd managed tire temperature better in the formation lap, ran 4th through the first hour while Lee Gable found the rhythm of the engine in race conditions. Different from testing, different from practice. The specific aliveness of competition that changes what a machine asks of the person using it. Holt stood at the pit wall with his arms on the barrier, watching the timing screens and listening to the sound of number 2 every time it came through the sector. He'd built that engine 15 years ago in a facility that no longer existed, for a company that had subsequently taken it from him, and it was now in a race car driven by a man whose father had listened to its predecessors on a radio or a television and had remembered the sound for the rest of his life. There was something in that he couldn't have articulated cleanly, so he didn't try. He just stood there and listened. Dell came to stand beside him in the second hour. They watched the screens together for several minutes without talking, which was the right amount of talking. "She's running clean," Dell said. "Yeah," Holt said. "Oil pressure's been solid, temperature holding. I know. I can see the telemetry." "I know you can see the telemetry." A pause. "I'm saying it anyway." Holt looked at him. Dell's face had the expression it got when he was satisfied with something that had been a long time in the making, the specific satisfaction of a person who works carefully and waits and is proved right not by argument but by outcome. 12 years of consulting work in Tennessee. 4 years before that of the same kind of contained anger Holt had carried, the same kind of determined quietness. "You should have called me sooner," Dell said. "I know." 4 years, Holt. "I know, Dell." I'm not going back over it," Dell said. "I'm just saying." "I know," Holt said. "You're right." Dell nodded and looked back at the screens, and that was the end of that. Wren found Holt at the pit wall between the second and third hours, navigating the paddock with the self-possession of someone twice her age, and stationed herself at his elbow with the quiet competence she brought to being present in spaces that weren't designed for 9-year-olds. She watched the timing screens and asked one question, which was about the gap between positions 2 and 3 and what it meant for the final hour. And Holt explained tire degradation rates and strategic decision-making in a way that was neither simplified nor excessive, and she nodded and kept watching. Marin appeared behind them and put her hand briefly on Wren's shoulder. A light touch, the kind of gesture you make with someone you've been around long enough to touch without thinking about it. Wren reached up and briefly covered Marin's hand with her own, also without thinking about it, and then put her hand back down and kept watching the screens. Holt felt something move through him that he was going to leave unnamed for now, because it was the kind of thing that needed time before it could be held steadily, and he was still learning to give things time. Number 17 moved to third in the final 40 minutes when the car ahead developed a mechanical issue and pitted. Lee Gable held third through a series of lapped traffic situations that required patience and precision, protecting his tires, protecting his gaps, and in the last 12 minutes, when the second-place car began to show the same degradation that had taken the leader earlier, he began to close. He crossed the line second. The sound number 2 made going through the final corner before the finish line, the specific note of a VP7 at 9,000 RPM under race load, was the same sound it had made in Wexler's dyno cell 11 months earlier. The same sound, in the same key, doing what it had been built to do. In the pit lane, Lee Gable's crew erupted. Dell, who was not a person who erupted, allowed himself a single raised fist before resuming his normal composure. Wexler, who'd come up from Mooresville out of something he claimed was professional curiosity, shook his head slowly and said something to himself that no one heard. Holt stood at the barrier and watched the car come down the pit lane and felt the kind of quiet that exists inside loud places, the stillness at the center of something that has gone right after a long time of going wrong. Wren said, "Second." "Second?" he said. "That's really good." "Yeah," he said. "It is." She thought about it for a moment. "Next time first?" He looked at her, this 9-year-old person with her mother's dark eyes and his own stubborn silences, who had grown up in a shop that smelled like oil and who knew engine numbers the way other kids knew their friends' names, and who had watched the last 14 months with the patience of someone much older and the openness of someone much younger. "Probably," he said, "if the setup's right." "You'll make the setup right," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a person stating the obvious. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and they stood at the pit wall and watched Lee Gable bring number 17 home. Later, after the celebrations and the debrief and the logistics of loading out, Holt and Marin sat in the empty pit lane with the track gone quiet around them, the November dark coming in fast from the hills, the circuit lights beginning to come on in sections. Wren was asleep in the hospitality area, draped across 2 chairs with her jacket as a blanket, with Dell sitting nearby reading something on his phone, in keeping without being asked the quiet watch that she didn't know she had. Marin had her hands around a cup of coffee that was getting cold. Holt had his forearms on his knees and was looking at the track. My father used to say that the most honest thing a company could do was make something that worked, she said. Not promise to make it, not present a vision of making it, actually make a thing that did what it was supposed to do. He was right, Holt said. He was right about a lot of things. He was wrong about who he trusted. She paused. I understand better now why people get that wrong. When you're building something, you want to believe the people around you are building it with you. It's easier to work that way. It costs something. To stay suspicious. It costs something either way, Holt said. You're just choosing which thing to pay. She looked at him. I trusted Voss the way my father trusted the board. I didn't know what I didn't know. You found out, he said. And then you did something about it. I had help. Yeah, he said. You did. She looked at the track. A circuit maintenance vehicle was moving slowly along the far straight, its orange lights tracing a lazy arc. The evening was cold and clear, and the sky above the hills was the kind of dark that happens in places without much ambient light, the stars more visible than city people expected. What happens now? She said. It was a question with a large circumference. He understood that she was asking it about more than the VP7 program, more than the company, more than the legal proceedings and the restoration work and the circuit partnership. She was asking it about the specific shape of things going forward, about the arrangement that had grown between two people who'd started as strangers with a contract dispute and had become, over 14 months of Tuesdays and cold coffee, and a child who watched for a specific car by its sound, something that neither of them had named yet, because naming felt premature, and also because neither of them was in the habit of naming things before they were ready. He thought about Claire, the way he always thought about her when something important was happening, not with the crushing weight that it had been in the early years, not even with sadness exactly, but with the specific quality of holding someone in memory the way they deserve to be held, present and real, and not diminished by time. He thought about 2-year-old Wren, who'd needed everything and had gotten what she needed because he'd had no other option than to give it. He thought about a filing cabinet through 3 moves and 6 engines he couldn't destroy, and a second stool he'd put beside the engine block because someone had asked to understand. I don't know exactly, he said, but I think it involves the remaining 5 teams getting their engines dialed in before the spring series opener, and probably Dell complaining about the facility's bearing measurement tools for another month before I order new ones. And Wren having opinions about everything. He paused. And you still driving up on Tuesdays? She was quiet for a moment, then, just Tuesdays? He looked at her. She was looking at the track, but the corner of her expression was doing something that she was not fully suppressing, which was new because she'd been very good at suppression for most of the time he'd known her. We can negotiate, he said. She looked at him then, full on, with the expression that didn't have the professional layer over it, the one that had been appearing with increasing frequency over the months until it had become, somewhere in the fall, simply the way she looked at him. Hargrove will want terms in writing, she said. Hargrove can wait, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the track and drank her cold coffee and didn't say anything else. And neither did he, and the quiet between them was the kind that doesn't need filling. Here's what Holt Caldwell would not have told you if you'd asked him, because he was not the kind of person who made speeches. That the thing about losing everything is that it teaches you, very slowly and at significant cost, the difference between what you thought you needed and what you actually need. He thought he needed the recognition. He thought he needed the compensation, the credit, the professional record corrected. Those things had come in their way, and they mattered. He didn't want to pretend they didn't. But what he'd actually needed, the thing that had been missing in the years of the small, quiet life he'd built and that he hadn't known was missing until it was no longer absent, was simpler and harder to articulate. It was the feeling of the work being seen, not publicized, not celebrated, just seen, understood by someone who looked at it and grasped what it had cost and what it had been worth, and who sat on a second stool and asked real questions until they understood it the way it deserved to be understood. Marin Vron had done that. She'd done it imperfectly, in the beginning, and she'd corrected it, and she'd kept showing up on Tuesdays until the understanding was complete. That was not a small thing. In Holt's experience it was, in fact, among the largest things. And here's what Maren Vron would not have told you if you'd asked her, because she'd spent enough years in boardrooms to understand that vulnerability was information and information was risk, that she'd spent her 20s believing competence was armor, that if you were good enough at your job, the other things, the aloneness, the absence of anyone who knew you outside the context of what you produced, were the price you paid for the life you'd chosen, and that it was a reasonable price, and that she'd chosen it with her eyes open. She had not understood until she sat on a stool in an Asheville garage and watched a man explain a valve configuration with the focused love of someone describing the thing they'd built at their best, that the armor was also a door, that it kept things out. Yes, that was the point. That was also the cost. A 9-year-old girl who noticed cars by their sound had walked straight through that door without knowing it was there. Her father had come through more slowly, more carefully, with the caution of someone who'd been hurt by what openness cost and who'd decided the cost was worth paying anyway, which Maren recognized as the more honest form of courage. Not the kind that doesn't count the cost, but the kind that counts it fully and opens the door regardless. She was still learning that. She thought she'd be learning it for a while. The lights over the empty circuit came on fully now, illuminating the track in the particular harsh clarity of race lighting, designed to flatten shadows, to make everything visible, to leave nowhere for uncertainty to hide. Holt stood up from his crouch and offered his hand to pull her up, and she took it, and they walked back toward the hospitality area, where Dell was keeping quiet watch over a sleeping 9-year-old who'd drawn the engine bay and the testing facility and the 2 figures at the assembly stand, and had kept the drawings in a folder she'd labeled in her careful handwriting with a word that Holt found when he was cleaning the Charlotte facility office in December. The word was ours. He'd held the folder for a long time when he found it. Then he'd put it back exactly where she'd left it, because it was hers to keep, and because she was right, and because some things you built the first time with your hands and the second time with your life, and the second kind was the one that lasted.